I'm Lieutenant Commander Lizzie Kent, 29, and I built my career in the Navy from the ground up through discipline and service. For years, I carried my family's weight, paying their bills, fixing their mistakes, showing up when no one else would. But when they humiliated me at a military banquet, pretending I didn't even exist, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed or erased by the very people you gave everything to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I dive into what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being overlooked, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries and reclaiming your worth. What came next might surprise you. I learned early that being the reliable one meant carrying everyone else's weight. While my siblings stumbled through adolescence, making poor choices and creating family drama, I was the one who cleaned up the mess. When my brother crashed Dad's car at 17, I worked extra shifts at the grocery store to help cover the deductible. When my sister dropped out of college halfway through her sophomore year, I was the one who called the registrar's office to negotiate a partial tuition refund. When Mom needed surgery and the insurance company dragged their feet on approval, I spent hours on hold with customer service representatives until we got the coverage sorted. My parents never asked me to do these things. I simply stepped in because that's what responsible daughters did. I told myself it was temporary, that once everyone got back on their feet, the dynamic would shift. I'd get my turn to be supported, to be celebrated, to matter in the way that seemed to come so naturally to my siblings. But years passed, and the pattern only deepened. They came to expect my intervention. When problems arose, they looked to me not with gratitude but with assumption. Of course I would handle it. Of course I would figure it out. Of course I would sacrifice whatever I needed to sacrifice to keep the family functioning. During family dinners, I watched my parents beam with pride when my brother talked about his latest business venture, even though it was his fourth failed startup in 6 years. When my sister announced she was moving to a new city to find herself, they nodded supportively and asked thoughtful questions about her plans. But when I mentioned my promotion to lieutenant or the commendation I'd received for exceptional service, the conversation shifted quickly to safer topics. Their discomfort with my success was palpable, though I couldn't understand why. I joined the Navy at 22. Partly for the educational benefits and partly to prove something to myself about discipline and purpose. The structure suited me. I thrived under clear expectations and earned recognition for my work ethic and leadership abilities. My commanding officers trusted me with increasingly complex responsibilities. My peers respected my judgment. But when I came home in uniform, my family treated me like I was playing dress-up. They asked polite questions about military life the way you might ask a child about their imaginary friend. The disparity became more obvious as I advanced in rank. My siblings continued to drift through life, making questionable decisions, and my parents continued to support them unconditionally. My brother borrowed money he never repaid. My sister moved back home twice when relationships fell apart. Neither of them seemed particularly grateful for the family safety net, yet both received endless patience and understanding. Meanwhile, I sent money home regularly, visited during leave, and called weekly to check on everyone's well-being. I received thank you cards that felt obligatory and conversations that felt stilted. I told myself their awkwardness around my military career was cultural. We weren't a military family. They didn't understand the hierarchy or the commitment involved. But deep down, I knew it was more than unfamiliarity. My success highlighted their failures as parents and their other children's lack of direction. Instead of feeling proud, they seemed embarrassed. Instead of bragging about my achievements to neighbors and friends, they deflected attention away from my accomplishments. The irony wasn't lost on me. The child who had spent years protecting the family's reputation was now seen as a threat to it. My dedication to service, my financial stability, my clear sense of purpose, these should have been points of family pride. Instead, they created distance. My parents worried that my success made them look bad by comparison, as if my achievements were an indictment of their parenting rather than a testament to it. I began to notice how they introduced me at social gatherings. My brother was starting an exciting new company. My sister was exploring her creative passions. I was simply our daughter, or worse, the quiet one. The military honors, the steady promotions, the respect I'd earned among my peers, none of it translated to respect at home. I might as well have been invisible for all the acknowledgement my life's work received. Still, I kept showing up. I attended every birthday party, every holiday gathering, every family celebration. I brought thoughtful gifts and listened to their stories and offered support when they needed it. I told myself that love didn't require recognition, that doing the right thing was its own reward. But each gathering chipped away at my sense of belonging. I was present in body but increasingly absent in spirit, going through the motions of family connection while feeling more isolated than ever. The worst part was the way they talked around me rather than to me. Conversations about family history excluded my experiences. Planning for future events happened without my input. They discussed my siblings' lives in detail, but skimmed over mine with superficial pleasantries. I was simultaneously essential and invisible, needed for my reliability, but dismissed for my success. The contradiction created a constant tension that I carried in my chest like a physical weight. I started to understand that I had been assigned a role in the family narrative, and that role didn't include being celebrated or even fully acknowledged. I was the supporting character in everyone else's story. My function was to solve problems, provide stability, and remain quietly in the background while others took center stage. The realization was devastating because it meant that all my efforts to earn their respect had been fundamentally misguided. They didn't want me to succeed beyond my assigned role. They wanted me to remain the reliable one who asked for nothing and expected less. By my late 20s, I had achieved everything I'd set out to achieve professionally. I'd earned the respect of my superiors and peers. I'd built a life of purpose and meaning. Yet I continued to chase approval from the people who seemed least capable of giving it. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. I knew my worth in every context except the one that had shaped me. At home, I reverted to the accommodating daughter who swallowed her disappointment and tried harder to please. As I got older, the family dynamic solidified rather than evolved. My siblings settled into patterns of underachievement that my parents enabled with endless patience and financial support. I continued advancing in my career, earning recognition, and taking on leadership roles that required me to be decisive and confident. But the moment I walked into my childhood home, I became someone smaller, quieter, less significant. The transformation happened so automatically that I barely noticed it anymore. I had internalized their assessment of my worth and made it my own. The invitations to family events continued, but they felt increasingly ceremonial. I was expected to attend, to bring gifts, to ask the right questions and make the appropriate responses. But my presence was taken for granted rather than valued. I was there to fill a seat and fulfill an obligation, not to be celebrated or even genuinely included. The pattern had become so entrenched that none of us questioned it anymore. This was simply how our family functioned, and I was simply the daughter who accepted whatever scraps of attention came my way. The signs were everywhere if I'd been willing to see them. At my cousin's wedding 2 years earlier, the photographer asked for pictures of the successful family members and naturally gravitated toward my siblings while I stood awkwardly to the side. During my grandmother's funeral, relatives I hadn't seen in years asked detailed questions about my brother's work and my sister's relationships, but never inquired about my military service. When my father gave a toast at my mother's 60th birthday party, he spoke glowingly about each of his children, except he somehow managed to describe my siblings' minor accomplishments while skipping over my major ones entirely. Each slight felt deliberate, though I knew they probably weren't conscious of the pattern. They had simply decided, somewhere along the way, that my achievements didn't fit the story they wanted to tell about their family. Success in the military was too foreign, too intimidating, too removed from their world to celebrate properly. It was easier to downplay my accomplishments than to figure out how to acknowledge them appropriately. So they chose the path of least resistance and pretended I was ordinary. The praise they offered felt hollow because it focused on qualities that kept me in my assigned role. They complimented my thoughtfulness when I remembered birthdays or my generosity when I helped with expenses. But they never acknowledged my intelligence, my leadership abilities, or my professional achievements. They celebrated the parts of me that served them while ignoring the parts that had grown beyond their expectations. The message was clear. They preferred me small and accommodating rather than accomplished and independent. I tried different approaches to earn their recognition. I brought colleagues to family events, hoping that outside validation might help them see me differently. I shared stories about my work responsibilities, thinking that concrete details might help them understand the scope of my achievements. I even brought newspaper clippings about ceremonies I'd attended or programs I'd helped develop. But nothing penetrated their determined indifference to my professional life. They absorbed the information politely and then changed the subject to something more comfortable. The breaking point was building slowly, gathering momentum with each dismissive comment and ignored achievement. I was tired of being grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. I was tired of making excuses for their behavior and my own accommodation of it. I was tired of being the daughter who asked for nothing while everyone else asked for everything. Most of all, I was tired of believing that their opinion of me mattered more than my own knowledge of what I'd accomplished. But I wasn't ready to walk away entirely. Some part of me still hoped that the next gathering would be different, that they'd finally see me clearly and acknowledge what I'd built. Hope is a stubborn thing, especially when it's mixed with loyalty and love. So I kept showing up, kept trying, kept believing that eventually they'd run out of ways to diminish me and start celebrating me instead. The banquet would test that hope in ways I couldn't have imagined. The morning of the banquet, I pressed my dress uniform with extra care. The ceremony was meant to honor distinguished service members from our region, and I was attending as one of the recipients of a special recognition award. My family had been invited because they were supposed to be proud of me that night. This was their chance to see me acknowledged publicly for the work I'd dedicated my life to. I allowed myself to imagine their faces when my name was called, their applause when I walked to the stage, their excitement when they introduced me to their friends afterward. I arrived early and found my assigned table near the back of the banquet hall. The seating chart placed me with other service members and their families, which should have felt natural and comfortable. But as my family members arrived and took their seats, I could feel the familiar tension settling over our group. They greeted the other families with polite smiles, but seemed uncomfortable with the military setting. My father tugged at his tie and kept checking his watch. My mother clutched her purse and spoke in the hushed tones she reserved for churches and hospitals. The conversation at our table started normally enough. Introductions were made, pleasantries exchanged, backgrounds shared. But as the evening progressed, I noticed my family's behavior becoming increasingly cold toward me. They talked animatedly with the other families about their children's accomplishments, but when attention turned to me, their responses became clipped and dismissive. When asked about my service record, my father gave vague answers that downplayed my achievements. When my mother was complimented on raising such a dedicated daughter, she smiled tightly and changed the subject. The snubbing became more obvious as the evening wore on. During cocktails, they mingled with other attendees, but somehow never included me in their conversations. When we returned to our seats for dinner, they positioned themselves so that I was physically separated from their cluster of chairs. They laughed at each other's jokes and shared family stories that excluded me entirely. To an outside observer, it might have looked like I was a stranger who had wandered over to join their table uninvited. The most cutting moment came during the pre-ceremony reception when my father was talking to another parent about children in military service. I was standing close enough to hear him describe my brother's important work in business development and my sister's creative talents in design, but when the conversation turned to military service specifically, he simply said, "Well, we have one in the Navy, but she's nothing special here." The casual cruelty of that dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Not only was he unwilling to acknowledge my achievements, he was actively undermining them in front of people who were there specifically to celebrate service members. I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, needing a moment to compose myself. In the mirror, I looked at my uniform with its ribbons and insignia, each one representing months or years of dedicated service. I thought about the young sailors I'd mentored, the programs I'd developed, the crises I'd helped navigate. I thought about the respect I commanded at work and the trust my superiors placed in my judgment. Then I thought about my father's words, nothing special here, and felt the familiar ache of being invisible to the people who should have known me best. When I returned to the table, the formal ceremony was about to begin. My family had arranged themselves in a tight cluster that didn't include space for me, so I took a seat slightly apart from their group. They were talking quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing around the room at the other families and the elaborate decorations. But they never looked at me, never asked if I was nervous or excited, never acknowledged that this night was about recognizing people like me. I might as well have been a piece of furniture for all the attention they paid to my presence. The ceremony began with speeches from local officials and military leaders. As they spoke about service and sacrifice and the importance of recognizing those who dedicate their lives to protecting others, I felt a growing disconnect between their words and my family's behavior. Here were strangers praising the very qualities my family seemed determined to ignore. The speakers talked about honor and commitment and leadership, all things I'd worked years to embody, while my own relatives sat beside me acting as though I'd never done anything worthy of acknowledgement. During one particularly moving speech about the courage it takes to serve, I glanced over at my family and saw them checking their phones and whispering to each other about unrelated topics. They weren't just failing to celebrate me, they were actively disengaged from an event that was specifically meant to honor people like me. Their disrespect wasn't limited to me personally, it extended to the entire concept of military service and the sacrifices it required. That realization made their behavior even more painful because it revealed how little they understood or valued the path I'd chosen. As the evening continued and my name drew closer to being called, I found myself hoping less for their pride and more for their basic courtesy. I didn't need them to cheer or make speeches about how wonderful I was. I just needed them to pay attention when I walked to the stage, to clap politely when my achievements were read aloud, to act like they were happy to be there. But even that minimal level of support seemed beyond their capability. They had made their position clear, they were attending under sufferance, and nothing that happened that night was going to change their assessment of my worth. The final straw came when I overheard my mother telling another parent that they were just here to support the military in general, rather than acknowledging that they were there specifically to support me. It was a small thing, but it captured everything wrong with our dynamic. They couldn't even admit publicly that I was their daughter in this context. They had to distance themselves from my achievements even while sitting at a table designated for my family. The message was unmistakable. They were embarrassed by me, and they wanted everyone to know that my success wasn't really connected to them. I kept my expression neutral and my posture straight, but inside I was reeling. This was supposed to be my night, my moment of recognition, my chance to be celebrated for the work I'd dedicated my life to. Instead, I was sitting alone among my own family members, feeling more isolated than I'd ever felt in my life. They had managed to turn what should have been a proud moment into another reminder that I didn't matter to them, that my accomplishments were somehow shameful rather than praiseworthy, that I was an embarrassment they had to endure rather than a daughter they wanted to celebrate. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to earn their approval, all the ways I'd sacrificed my own needs to meet theirs, all the times I'd put their comfort above my own dignity. And for what? So I could sit at this table being ignored by people who should have been proudest of me? So I could watch them distance themselves from my achievements while benefiting from my success? So I could continue to accept their scraps of attention while they lavished praise on siblings who had accomplished far less? The realization that I was done chasing their approval came suddenly and with surprising clarity. I didn't need them to validate me. I didn't need them to understand my choices or celebrate my achievements. I didn't need anything from them at all, which was fortunate because they had made it clear they had nothing to give me anyway. The freedom that came with that realization was both liberating and terrifying. If I stopped trying to earn their love, what would be left of our relationship? But then I looked around the table at their determined indifference and realized there wasn't much of a relationship to preserve. The moment I gave up on their approval was the moment I started to see the evening differently. Instead of focusing on their reaction to my recognition, I began to notice the other families celebrating their service members. I saw genuine pride and excitement and love. I saw parents who understood what their children had accomplished and wanted everyone else to understand too. I saw families who had made their service member the center of attention rather than a source of embarrassment. I saw what family support was supposed to look like, and it bore no resemblance to what I was experiencing. A colleague seated at a nearby table caught my eye and smiled warmly. She was there with her parents, who had driven 4 hours to attend the ceremony. They were asking her questions about the various awards being presented and taking pictures of every moment. When she pointed me out to them, they waved enthusiastically and gave me a thumbs up. Their genuine enthusiasm for my recognition stood in stark contrast to my own family's determined disinterest. It reminded me that respect and celebration were possible, just not from the people I'd been trying so hard to please. As the ceremony moved toward the moment when my name would be called, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. I was about to be honored for my service regardless of whether my family acknowledged it. The recognition was real whether they celebrated it or not. My achievements were valid whether they understood them or not. Their opinion of me was just one opinion among many, and it was far from the most informed or generous one. I had spent too many years giving their assessment of my worth more weight than it deserved. When I finally heard my name announced and rose to walk to the stage, I walked for myself and for everyone who had believed in me along the way. I walked for the mentors who had guided my career and the peers who had supported my ambitions. I walked for the young service members who looked up to me and the superiors who had entrusted me with important responsibilities. I walked for everyone who had seen my potential and helped me achieve it. My family's reaction, or lack thereof, was irrelevant to the significance of the moment. But as I approached the stage, something unexpected happened that would change everything. The Admiral stood and surveyed the room with the kind of commanding presence that made everyone pay attention. The casual conversations died away and the atmosphere shifted from social to official. He was a man whose career I'd followed and whose leadership style I'd studied, someone whose respect meant something concrete in the world I'd chosen to inhabit. When he spoke, people listened not just because of his rank, but because of what he'd accomplished and the integrity he brought to everything he did. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily across the banquet hall without amplification. "Before we continue with tonight's ceremony, I need to address something that has come to my attention." He paused and looked directly at our table, his gaze settling on me with unmistakable recognition. "We have a guest of honor tonight whose service record speaks to the very best of what military leadership can achieve. Lieutenant Commander Lizzie Kent has not only distinguished herself through exceptional performance, but has also mentored the next generation of naval officers with remarkable skill and dedication." The room had gone completely silent. I felt my face flush as hundreds of pairs of eyes turned toward me, but I kept my expression steady and my shoulders straight. This wasn't how these ceremonies usually went. There was supposed to be an orderly progression through the evening's events, not an impromptu spotlight on individual recipients. But the Admiral continued speaking, and his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "I've had the privilege of reviewing Lieutenant Commander Kent's file in preparation for tonight's ceremony, and I want to share with you what I found there." He began reading from a folder he'd apparently brought to the podium with him. Exemplary performance evaluations year after year. Innovation in training protocols that have been adopted fleet-wide. Leadership during a crisis situation that prevented loss of life and earned her a commendation for exceptional service. Volunteer work with veterans organizations that has impacted hundreds of lives. This is not just a service record, this is a blueprint for what dedicated leadership looks like. I could feel my family's discomfort radiating from their end of the table, but I didn't dare look at them. Instead, I focused on the Admiral's words and tried to absorb the magnitude of what was happening. He was describing my career with an accuracy and respect that my own family had never managed. He understood what each achievement meant and why it mattered. He saw the connections between my various responsibilities and how they built on each other. Most importantly, he valued what I'd accomplished in a way that felt both professional and personal. But beyond her impressive record of service, the Admiral continued, "Lieutenant Commander Kent represents something that I think we sometimes take for granted in our military families. She represents the sacrifice that service members make not just in their professional lives, but in their personal ones. The long deployments, the missed holidays, the constant moves, these burdens are carried not just by our service members, but by their families as well. Tonight we honor not just individual achievement, but family support." He gestured toward our table, and I knew that everyone in the room was now looking at my family as well as me. They had wanted to be invisible, to attend without being noticed or associated with my achievements. Instead, they were being held up as examples of military family support by one of the most respected leaders in the region. The irony was so perfect it was almost painful. They were receiving credit for supporting a career they had consistently undermined and achievements they had actively dismissed. "That's why," the Admiral continued, "I'd like Lieutenant Commander Kent and her family to join me on stage. In all my years of service, I've learned that individual achievement is always built on a foundation of family support and community investment. Tonight we celebrate not just what Lieutenant Commander Kent has accomplished, but the family that shaped those accomplishments and continues to support her service." The invitation was clearly an order dressed in polite language. I rose from my seat and began walking toward the stage, acutely aware that my family had no choice but to follow. The applause that erupted from the audience was genuine and sustained, the kind of recognition I'd dreamed of receiving in front of my relatives. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. This was the acknowledgement I'd craved, but it was coming from strangers while my family reluctantly followed behind me, trapped in a situation they couldn't escape. As we reached the stage, the Admiral shook my hand with genuine warmth and respect. His grip was firm and his eye contact direct, the kind of interaction that conveyed real professional regard. Then he turned to my family with the same courtesy, thanking them for their support of my career and their sacrifice on behalf of military service. My parents smiled and nodded appropriately, but I could see the strain around their eyes. They were participating in a charade, accepting praise for support they had never provided while being publicly associated with achievements they had spent years trying to minimize. The Admiral presented me with my award and spoke briefly about each element of my service record that had contributed to the recognition. As he detailed my accomplishments, I watched my family's faces out of the corner of my eye. They were hearing, perhaps for the first time, a comprehensive summary of what I'd actually been doing for the past decade. The Admiral's description made clear that I hadn't just been serving in the Navy in some vague, generic way. I had been leading, innovating, mentoring, and achieving at the highest levels of my profession. The moment that crystallized everything came when the Admiral asked my father to share a few words about having a daughter in military service. My father stepped forward to the microphone, cleared his throat, and struggled visibly to find appropriate words. The man who had dismissed me as nothing special just hours earlier was now being asked to speak publicly about my achievements in front of hundreds of people and one of the most senior officers in the region. "We're very proud of Lizzie," he managed, his voice uncertain and his face noticeably red. "She's always been dedicated to serving others, and we're honored to be here tonight to see her recognized for that service." The words were generic and clearly improvised, but they were also the closest thing to genuine acknowledgement I'd ever heard from him in public. The Admiral thanked him graciously and then invited my mother to add her thoughts. My mother stepped to the microphone with the same uncomfortable expression my father had worn. "Lizzie has always been someone you could count on," she said carefully. "She's made sacrifices for her service that we sometimes don't fully appreciate, and tonight helps us understand better what those sacrifices have achieved." Again, the words were careful and formal, but they contained an admission that they had failed to appreciate my service properly. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement of their previous dismissiveness. The Admiral concluded the impromptu ceremony by thanking my family again and asking the audience to give us another round of applause. As we walked back to our seats, I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following us, but this time it felt different. Instead of being invisible or dismissed, I had been publicly celebrated and my family had been forced to participate in that celebration. The recognition I'd received was now part of the public record, witnessed by people who would remember it and talk about it long after the evening ended. When we returned to our table, the atmosphere had completely shifted. The other families were congratulatory and warm, treating me with the kind of respect that comes from witnessing someone receive high-level recognition. They asked detailed questions about my service and complimented my family on raising such a dedicated daughter. My parents had no choice but to accept these compliments graciously and participate in conversations about my achievements. For the first time in memory, I was the center of positive attention at a family gathering, and they had to go along with it. But even as I savored the moment, I was aware of its limitations. The recognition was real and meaningful, but it had taken an intervention from someone outside our family to make it happen. My parents' words of praise had been prompted by public pressure, not private pride. They were participating in my success because they had been put on the spot, not because they had genuinely changed their assessment of my worth. The Admiral's actions had forced a public reckoning, but I wasn't naive enough to think they had fundamentally altered my family's private attitudes. Still, something important had shifted that night. The dismissive comments and casual undermining that had characterized their treatment of me for years had been publicly contradicted by someone whose opinion carried real weight. They could no longer pretend that my achievements were insignificant or that my service was just a job like any other. The Admiral's detailed knowledge of my record and his obvious respect for my accomplishments had established a new baseline for how my military career would be discussed in family contexts. The rest of the ceremony proceeded normally, but I was barely paying attention to the other presentations. I was still processing what had happened and what it meant for my relationship with my family going forward. The public recognition had been gratifying, but it had also highlighted just how little support I'd received from the people who should have been proudest of me. The contrast between the Admiral's detailed knowledge of my achievements and my family's determined ignorance was stark and painful. As the evening wound down and people began saying their goodbyes, several attendees approached me to offer personal congratulations and share their own stories of military service. They treated me as someone worth knowing and talking to, someone whose experiences and insights had value. The conversations were substantive and respectful, focused on my work rather than on managing my feelings or avoiding uncomfortable topics. It reminded me what genuine interest and respect felt like, and it made my family's behavior over the years seem even more inadequate by comparison. My family participated in these conversations, but remained somewhat on the periphery, acknowledging the praise I was receiving, but not really contributing to it. They had been forced to witness my public recognition, but they hadn't suddenly developed detailed knowledge of my career or genuine enthusiasm for my achievements. They were going through the motions of supportive family members because the social situation required it, but I could tell they were still uncomfortable with the attention my service was receiving. When we finally left the banquet hall and walked to our cars, the silence between us felt different than it had earlier in the evening. It wasn't the familiar silence of dismissal and indifference. It was the more complex silence of people trying to figure out what had changed and what it meant going forward. They couldn't undo their years of minimizing my achievements, but they also couldn't ignore what had happened that night. The Admiral's public praise had created a new reality that we all had to navigate. As I drove home alone, I reflected on the evening's events and their implications. The recognition I'd received was validating and important, but it had also revealed the extent of my family's failure to support me appropriately. I was grateful for the Admiral's intervention, but I was also sad that it had been necessary. I shouldn't have needed a senior officer to force my family to acknowledge my worth. That support should have come naturally and consistently over the years. But I was also beginning to understand that their limitations didn't diminish my achievements or define my worth. The Admiral's detailed knowledge of my service record and his obvious respect for my accomplishments reflected the reality of what I'd built, regardless of whether my family understood or appreciated it. Their opinion was just one among many, and it was far from the most informed or generous. I had spent too many years giving their assessment more weight than it deserved. The evening had been a turning point, but not in the way I'd expected. Instead of finally earning my family's genuine respect and appreciation, I had learned that their respect wasn't necessary for my success or happiness. The recognition I'd received from the Admiral and the response from other attendees had shown me what genuine appreciation looked like, and it bore no resemblance to the grudging acknowledgement my family had offered under pressure. I deserved better than what they were capable of giving me, and it was time to stop pretending otherwise. The days following the banquet brought a series of awkward conversations and half-hearted attempts at reconciliation that only reinforced my growing understanding of our family's dynamics. My mother called the morning after to say they were proud in their own way, a phrase that managed to sound like an apology while actually explaining away years of dismissive behavior. She talked around the issue rather than addressing it directly, suggesting that they had always supported me but perhaps hadn't expressed it clearly enough. The implication was that the problem was one of communication rather than genuine disrespect. My father's approach was even more uncomfortable. He showed up at my apartment unannounced a few days later, carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone who had been told he needed to make amends, but wasn't sure how to go about it. He mumbled something about being caught off guard by the Admiral's praise and not realizing how much I'd accomplished in my career. But even his attempted apology contained the seeds of further dismissal. He framed his ignorance of my achievements as an innocent oversight rather than a deliberate choice to remain uninformed about my life. "I guess we just didn't understand what you were doing over there," he said, gesturing vaguely as if my military service took place on another planet. We should have asked more questions. But the truth was that they had never wanted to ask questions. They had actively avoided learning about my work because it made them uncomfortable. They preferred to keep me in the role of the helpful daughter who solved problems quietly rather than the accomplished officer who had earned recognition and respect in a demanding profession. My siblings' reactions were perhaps the most revealing. My brother sent a text congratulating me on the award, but managed to make it about himself by adding that he'd always known I would do something important eventually. My sister called to say she'd heard about the ceremony from our parents and was happy for me, but she spent most of the conversation talking about her own struggles with finding meaningful work. Neither of them seemed to understand that the evening's events represented years of dedicated service rather than a single moment of recognition. They still saw my military career as something that had happened to me rather than something I had built through consistent effort and sacrifice. The most frustrating part of these conversations was their persistent suggestion that the problem had been a simple misunderstanding. They wanted to believe that their years of dismissive behavior could be explained away by unfamiliarity with military culture or uncertainty about how to express pride in ways I would understand. But I remembered too clearly the deliberate slights, the uncomfortable silences when I talked about my work, and the way they had actively avoided acknowledging my achievements even when those achievements were clearly explained to them. I began to realize that their discomfort with my success went deeper than unfamiliarity or poor communication. My achievements challenged the family narrative they preferred, one where my siblings were the stars and I was the reliable supporting character. My military career had given me independence, respect, and recognition that didn't fit their assigned role for me. They had invested years in seeing me as the daughter who asked for nothing and accomplished little beyond keeping everyone else's lives running smoothly. My actual achievements threatened that comfortable fiction. The banquet had forced them to confront the reality of what I'd built, but confronting reality didn't mean they were ready to embrace it. They wanted to make minimal adjustments that would allow them to claim they supported me while continuing to treat my achievements as less important than my siblings' much smaller accomplishments. They wanted to feel better about their behavior without actually changing their fundamental attitudes about my worth and my place in the family hierarchy. Over the following weeks, I found myself analyzing every interaction through this new lens of understanding. When my mother forwarded a newspaper article about military families, I could see her attempt to demonstrate interest in my world. But the article was generic and superficial, focused on emotional stories rather than professional achievements. She was trying to show support in a way that didn't require her to actually learn about or engage with the specifics of my career. It was effort without depth, gesture without genuine understanding. My father's attempts were even more transparent. He started asking basic questions about military rank structure and deployment schedules, questions he could have asked at any point during my decade of service if he'd actually wanted to know the answers. His sudden interest felt performative, designed to demonstrate that he was trying rather than reflecting genuine curiosity about my work. The timing made it clear that his questions were motivated by guilt about the banquet rather than authentic desire to understand my life better. But perhaps the most telling response came from observing how they talked about the evening to other people. When relatives called to congratulate them on my recognition, they accepted the praise graciously, but managed to keep their own role in my success vague. They never quite claimed credit for supporting my career, but they didn't correct assumptions that they had been instrumental in my achievements. They were happy to be associated with my success now that it had been publicly validated, but they weren't willing to admit they had failed to recognize or support that success along the way. I realized that what I was witnessing was damage control rather than genuine change. They were adjusting their behavior just enough to avoid further embarrassment while hoping that the fundamental dynamic between us could remain unchanged. They wanted to be able to claim they supported me without actually having to support me in meaningful ways going forward. They wanted the social benefits of being associated with my achievements without the work of actually understanding or celebrating those achievements. The insight was both liberating and sad. Liberating because it freed me from the expectation that they would ever genuinely change their assessment of my worth. Sad because it meant accepting that the family relationships I'd spent years trying to repair were fundamentally flawed in ways that couldn't be fixed through better communication or increased effort on my part. I decided to test my new understanding by setting some boundaries around how much emotional energy I was willing to invest in their approval. When my mother called with updates about family news, I listened politely, but didn't offer solutions to problems that weren't mine to solve. When my father suggested we have lunch to catch up properly, I agreed, but didn't prepare talking points about my career or try to educate him about my work. I participated in family interactions as myself rather than as the accommodating daughter who worked overtime to earn recognition that never came. The results were predictable. Without my active efforts to bridge the gap between us, our conversations became shorter and more superficial. They weren't prepared to do the work of actually getting to know me as I was rather than as they preferred to see me. When I stopped volunteering information about my life and achievements, they didn't ask follow-up questions. When I stopped solving their problems automatically, they found other people to handle those responsibilities. The relationships didn't deepen. They simply revealed their true shallow nature. But something unexpected happened as I pulled back from chasing their approval. I started to notice and value the relationships in my life that were based on genuine mutual respect and understanding. My colleagues and fellow officers had always treated my achievements as significant and worthy of celebration. They asked informed questions about my work because they understood its importance. They celebrated my successes because they knew what those successes represented in terms of skill, dedication, and leadership. I also began to develop friendships outside the military that were based on who I actually was rather than who I thought I should be to earn approval. People who met me as an accomplished adult rather than as the accommodating daughter saw me differently and treated me differently. They appreciated my confidence, respected my opinions, and valued my company without requiring me to minimize my achievements or downplay my success to make them comfortable. The contrast was stark and instructive. In healthy relationships, my accomplishments were seen as interesting and admirable rather than threatening or embarrassing. People asked about my work because they were genuinely curious, not because they felt obligated to show interest. They celebrated my successes because those successes reflected well on me, not because celebrating me somehow diminished them. These relationships showed me what family support should have looked like all along. I found myself spending less time with my family and more time with people who actually enjoyed my company and respected my achievements. The shift wasn't dramatic or hostile. I didn't make angry declarations or issue ultimatums. I simply started investing my emotional energy where it was appreciated and returned rather than where it was taken for granted and dismissed. I remained available for genuine emergencies, but stopped volunteering for manufactured crises and family drama. The change in my availability forced my family to confront their own patterns of behavior. When they could no longer count on me to solve problems or provide unconditional support, they had to either address issues themselves or find other sources of help. Some problems that had seemed urgent when I was expected to handle them turned out to be manageable when they had to take responsibility for solutions. Others required them to develop skills and relationships they had avoided building while I was always available as a backup plan. My siblings' reactions to my new boundaries were particularly revealing. My brother, who had grown accustomed to borrowing money with vague promises of repayment, was genuinely confused when I stopped offering financial assistance automatically. He seemed to think that my reduced availability was a temporary phase rather than a permanent change in our relationship dynamic. My sister's response was more direct. She accused me of being selfish and abandoning the family when I declined to help her move apartments for the third time in 2 years. But I was learning to distinguish between actual family obligations and manufactured dependencies that kept me in the role of the giver who never received. Helping with genuine emergencies was part of being a caring family member. Providing endless bailouts for predictable consequences of poor decisions was enabling dysfunction rather than expressing love. The Admiral's recognition had given me perspective on my own worth, but learning to protect that worth required ongoing effort and vigilance. The process of rebuilding my self-respect was gradual and sometimes uncomfortable. I had to resist the urge to return to familiar patterns of accommodation when family tensions arose. I had to learn to sit with their disappointment in my new boundaries without immediately trying to fix their feelings or restore their approval. Most challenging of all, I had to accept that some relationships might not survive the transition from unequal accommodation to mutual respect. As months passed, I noticed that my family's attempts to pull me back into old patterns became less frequent and less intense. They were adapting to my unavailability by developing other resources and coping mechanisms. My mother started calling my sister for emotional support instead of automatically turning to me. My father began handling his own administrative tasks rather than expecting me to research and solve problems for him. My siblings found other sources of financial and practical assistance when their latest ventures ran into trouble. The family still gathered for major holidays and celebrations, but the dynamic was noticeably different. I attended as a guest rather than as the person responsible for managing everyone's comfort and happiness. I brought appropriate gifts and participated in conversations, but I didn't work overtime to keep things pleasant or solve underlying tensions. I was friendly but not accommodating, present but not available for duty beyond the basic requirements of family membership. My parents seemed uncertain how to interact with this version of me. They had grown accustomed to my eagerness to please and my availability for whatever they needed. My new boundaries forced them to relate to me as an independent adult with my own priorities rather than as the perpetually helpful daughter who could be counted on to prioritize their needs above my own. They weren't hostile exactly, but they were clearly uncomfortable with the change and uncertain about how to navigate it. The most significant shift came during a family birthday party where my father was telling stories about his children's accomplishments to relatives we hadn't seen in years. For the first time I could remember, he included my military service in his summary of family achievements. The description was brief and still somewhat generic, but it was acknowledgement rather than omission. When my aunt asked follow-up questions about my career, he deferred to me rather than trying to answer with incomplete information or changing the subject entirely. I realized that my withdrawal of unconditional accommodation had forced them to see me differently. When I was always available and eager to help, they could treat my presence as guaranteed and my achievements as irrelevant. But when I became selective about my availability and protective of my energy, they had to make conscious choices about whether they wanted me in their lives and what that relationship would look like going forward. The conversation with my aunt was particularly interesting because it gave me a chance to talk about my work with someone who was genuinely curious and appropriately impressed. She asked informed questions and made connections between different aspects of my service that showed she was actually listening and processing what I told her. Her responses reminded me of how the Admiral had spoken about my achievements, with understanding and respect rather than discomfort and dismissal. After the party, my father pulled me aside for what I initially expected to be another awkward attempt at apology or explanation. Instead, he said something that surprised me. "I never realized how much you'd accomplished until I heard you talking to your aunt tonight. I think maybe we should have paid more attention over the years." It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of their behavior, but it was closer to genuine recognition than anything I'd heard from him before. I thanked him for saying that, but I didn't rush to reassure him or minimize the years of dismissal and indifference. I had learned that accepting partial apologies too eagerly only encouraged them to think that minimal effort was sufficient to repair significant damage. Instead, I simply acknowledged his words and let him sit with the implications of what he'd admitted. If he genuinely wanted to change how he related to my achievements, he would need to demonstrate that change through consistent behavior over time. The months following that conversation showed mixed results. My parents made more effort to ask about my work when we talked, though their questions remained fairly superficial. They stopped actively dismissing my achievements in family conversations, though they didn't exactly celebrate them either. They seemed to be trying to find a middle ground between their previous indifference and the kind of genuine enthusiasm they had never learned to express appropriately. But I was no longer waiting for their enthusiasm or basing my self-worth on their approval. The Admiral's public recognition had been validating, but the real transformation had come from learning to value myself independently of their assessment. I had built a life of meaning and accomplishment that didn't require their understanding or celebration to be real and valuable. Their opinion was just one among many, and it was far from the most informed or generous. I continued to attend family gatherings and maintain basic relationships with my parents and siblings, but the desperate hunger for their approval was gone. I no longer needed them to see me clearly or celebrate my achievements. I no longer organized my life around earning recognition that they seemed constitutionally unable to provide. I was free to engage with them as they actually were rather than as I hoped they might become. The freedom was profound and somewhat surprising. I had expected that giving up on their approval would feel like loss or defeat. Instead, it felt like coming home to myself. I could appreciate my own accomplishments without needing external validation. I could make decisions based on my own values and priorities rather than on what might finally earn their respect. I could invest my emotional energy in relationships that were mutual and nourishing rather than one-sided and draining. Now, several years after the banquet, I can see that evening as the catalyst for a transformation that was probably inevitable. I had been moving toward greater independence and self-respect for years, but I needed the Admiral's public recognition to give me permission to stop chasing approval from people who were never going to provide it appropriately. His words didn't change my family's fundamental attitudes, but they changed my understanding of what I deserved and what I was willing to accept. My relationship with my family has stabilized at a level of cordial distance that works for everyone involved. They know they can reach me in genuine emergencies, and I know I don't have to justify my boundaries or apologize for my success. We exchange holiday cards and birthday wishes. We gather for major celebrations and maintain the basic courtesies of family membership. But I no longer look to them for validation or support, and they no longer expect me to be available for every crisis or convenience. The most important lesson from that entire experience was learning to distinguish between people who genuinely care about my well-being and people who simply want to use my confidence and reliability. My family fell into the second category, though they probably didn't realize it themselves. They loved the idea of me, the helpful daughter who solved problems and asked for nothing, but they had never been interested in knowing or celebrating the real me. The Admiral's intervention had forced a moment of public reckoning, but the real work of rebuilding my self-respect happened in the months and years that followed. I learned to trust my own assessment of my worth rather than waiting for external validation that might never come. I learned to invest my energy where it was appreciated rather than where it was taken for granted. Most importantly, I learned that respect doesn't always come from the people you most want it from, but when it does come from people who truly understand your work and character, it carries more weight than a lifetime of grudging acknowledgement from those who never bothered to know you well. The banquet was just one evening, but it marked the beginning of a new relationship with myself and my achievements. I stopped apologizing for my success and started celebrating it. I stopped making excuses for people who consistently failed to support me and started building relationships with people who actually valued what I brought to the table. I stopped waiting for my family to finally see me clearly and started seeing myself with the clarity and respect I had always deserved. In the end, the Admiral's recognition was meaningful not because it forced my family to acknowledge my worth, but because it reminded me that my worth existed independently of their acknowledgement. The applause that night came from strangers who understood what military service required and what my achievements represented. Their respect was informed and genuine in ways my family's grudging approval never could be. That contrast taught me everything I needed to know about where to invest my emotional energy and what kind of recognition actually mattered. The woman who walked onto that stage was accomplished and deserving of celebration. The woman who walked off had finally learned to celebrate herself. That transformation was worth more than all the family approval I had spent years trying to earn. It was the beginning of a life lived on my own terms, valued by people who actually knew me, and free from the exhausting pursuit of love that was always conditional on making myself smaller than I actually was. That night at the banquet taught me a hard truth. Sometimes the people closest to you are the last to see your worth. But it also showed me that recognition doesn't have to come from them to be real. Have you ever been overlooked or dismissed by your own family, only to be recognized by others? How did you handle it? Do you think family respect can ever be rebuilt, or is it better to move forward without it? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more real stories about boundaries, respect, and self-worth.